The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
I can have your attention.
It's a good one. Yeah.
Thanks for coming out tonight. Inspired by the discovery that an ancestor founded the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia in 1850, Janis Robinson Daly wrote her first novel, The Unlocked Path, which celebrates pioneering women doctors at the turn of the 20th century. In addition to being named a #1 new release for U.S. history on Amazon, the book received an honorable mention for general fiction from the 2023 New England Book Festival Awards and was named a finalist for the 2023 Goethe Awards of Late Historical Fiction from the Chanticleer International Book Awards. Daly graduated with a BA in psychology from Wheaton College, which at the time was a women's college. At Wheaton, she developed a fond appreciation of the supportive relationships established between students and a heightened awareness of female-centric issues. A presentation of how her genealogy research inspired her to begin writing has made Daly a sought-after speaker for book clubs, women's groups, libraries, and writers' groups.
Great.
Take it away.
So much, Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm sure you're probably here because you enjoy historical fiction. Reading. I certainly do. Have loved historical fiction probably since high school when I read Gone with the Wind. That really set with me. I absolutely loved the character of Scarlett O'Hara, and I loved being able to learn about the Civil War and the Reconstruction period just by reading that book. So I do have a pretty comprehensive overview of historical fiction, what I think is the inspiration and education that we can get from reading historical fiction, several titles that I'll reference. I think Megan was going to pull some of them and put them on display over at the library. I didn't realize it was two different buildings, but definitely, hopefully you'll check some of them out, and hopefully you'll check out a couple of my books. And I do have some for sale after the talk as well. And feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions too. So Miles pretty much gave my little backgrounder, so I don't have too much to cover there, except it did feel like a little bit of homecoming, getting off on exit 123. I attended Wheaton before it went co-ed and before 495 was in, which meant the bus to go to Boston used to come 123 all the way over to get onto 24. So I love coming back to visit this part of the state. So start out with a fun fact. I never intended to be a writer. I never had ambitions or aspirations to write a book. I enjoyed reading, and I did well in my English classes, but being a writer never crossed my mind. And it was truly when I started this genealogy research, when I wanted to explore my grandmother Robinson's family, who had roots in Philadelphia, that I really had that aha moment. And I think it's because when we delve into stories set in our ancestors' past, we can come to appreciate the challenges, the triumphs, and the cultural nuances that shape history. And I really think that those stories can inspire and educate. So I'll just start out real quick with a little bit of these three different people up on the screen. The first, on the far left, is my grandmother. This is a photo that I actually only found a few years ago. My cousin had it in her attic. So, and she gave it to me. But, you know, she was quite a striking young woman. She had beautiful red hair, which I never knew my grandmother. She passed 5 years before I was born. I had a little bit of red hair, redder when I was in Norton, but still thankful for my stylist at Mirror Image Salon. But she was a debutante in Philadelphia, growing up in a very affluent household with her grandfather, the gentleman in the middle, William Shannon Pierce. So my grandmother actually never met her father. Her mother was widowed when she was pregnant with my grandmother. And so she took her 2 older sons and her newborn, basically, and went to live back with her parents for a while. And that was with William Pierce and his wife and 4 unmarried sisters. Now, I never found any information in my genealogy research about my grandmother. You know, she never worked outside the home. She didn't attend college, so there was really nothing to find her. And she was a woman. There wasn't a lot about her to find in my online research. But I kind of hit the mother lode when I pulled up William Shannon Pierce. I knew that he was a judge. That had been kind of like family tidbits passed along. And I loved the name Pierce, so Judge Pierce. In fact, my oldest son is named James Pierce and has gone by Pierce forever. We thought he was going to be JP, and Pierce just clicked. So I did learn a lot about the judge. Before becoming a judge, he was a lawyer in Philadelphia, and he was involved in the abolitionist movement. So, you know, Civil War buff. Thank you, Gone with the Wind. I learned that he defended runaway slaves who, if they made it as far north as Philadelphia but were captured, they were tried under the Fugitive Slave Act and sent back mostly to their owners. Well, he defended cases and he won every single one. So he won the freedom for many, many runaway slaves. So I was really honored to learn about that of my ancestors past, you know, a man that believed in the rights of others, the rights to be free. But it was the last line in an entry about him in Famous Americans that stopped me dead in my tracks. He was a founder of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. So he had 7 daughters. And obviously was a very forward-thinking man, not only believing in the rights of the black slaves, but the rights for women to be educated. Now, of course, I knew that there were women's colleges that had started then. I remember my history that Wheaton was formed in 1834, but I never knew that there were women's medical colleges. And they started because, of course, women were denied admission to the medical schools, the Harvards and the Yales and the Johns Hopkins of the world. So I really got enamored with this idea, and I started researching women's medical, which was the first that opened in 1850 in Philadelphia. And when I started researching the school, I started to meet some of the students and graduates. And that's where I met the final woman up here on the screen, Anadubai Gopal Joshi, who was the first woman from India to earn a Western medical degree. So women came from all over the world to attend women's medical. And so I'm doing my research and I'm thinking, who knew there were women's medical colleges? Did anyone know?
Yeah, because I spent time in Philadelphia.
Okay.
So I heard of it.
Excellent. So you know that it eventually became co-ed and then eventually had an association with Hahnemann and then merged with Drexel. But I certainly didn't know that. But they're a perfect example of a term I heard the author Lisa Wingate. Has anyone read?
Yeah.
Before We Are Yours. So Lisa spoke at a historical novel society conference I attended a few years ago, and she talked about this term, that we're suffering from history deficient disorder. What and where are so many of our origin stories, the ones not found in our textbooks, and how do we find them? So I decided I was going to find the story of women's medical. And they did eventually merge with Drexel. And I was fortunate to go to Drexel because they have all the archives and all the materials from women's medical. You know, so I was able to spend time going over grade reports and financial records and correspondence and photographs and learning, you know, which classes they needed to take each year. How much do you think tuition was in 1897? Anyone want to venture a guess?
$100.
Yeah, pretty close, pretty good. $130. So I think we've had a little bit of inflation in 175 years. But you know, I'm just doing this research and I'm having a little inkling that maybe I'll do something with this research and maybe I'll write something. I don't know what, but maybe I'll write something because I just want to share this history. And I'm finishing up my day in the archives, and my new best friend, the archivist, comes to me, goes, I have one more thing to show to you. And he hands me some white gloves that he asked me to put on before I handled this item that was 175 years old. It was the original log books from the incorporators meetings. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, how did I get here? What am I doing? I was just searching for information about my family, and I had read that one little line. William Pierce had been a founder of the Women's Medical College, but what did that mean? He obviously a very affluent man. He could have been a benefactor, right? And they could have called him a founder. Well, I started to turn the pages with my white-gloved hands, and I see at the bottom of every entry is signed by the board secretary, William S. Pierce. So I'm holding in my white-gloved hands the pages that my great-great-grandfather had transcribed in his hand 170 years ago. And that's when I knew that I needed to do something with this information. And my ancestor needed to be honored for his work, and the women that attended that school needed to have their stories told. The pioneering women who unlocked the path for so many women in medicine today. So I just want to introduce you to a couple of women that I found in my research who graduated around the time where I ended up setting my book at the turn of the 20th century. Olga Pavinsky actually came from Lithuania, didn't speak a word of English when she arrived. Charlotte Fairbanks was from Vermont. Now, they're both medical doctors. They had earned their accredited degree. They did all of their residencies and everything. But why are these women in uniform instead of white coats? They were both part of a unit of 60 women who during World War I went to the US Army and volunteered their medical services to help. And what do you think the US Army said to them? No, thank you. We're not having women treat our casualties. Doctors. Nurses, fine, but not doctors. Even though Charlotte is an accomplished surgeon. These women, in their selfless call to practice medicine and to care for others, went to France on their own, self-funded themselves through donations, and they treated the French civilians until the US Army caught wind of them and what they were doing and started sending casualties to them. So I really felt that other people needed to know about these incredible types of women. So What started out as a personal journey into family history really formed that idea that a book needed to be written. And if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? Because I had never read about other women doctors in history in all of my historical fiction reading. So I had to then sit down and decide, well, what genre was I going to write? Certainly I could write a nonfiction and just focus on the history of the Women's Medical College and some of the graduates, until I found that had already been done. Thankfully, because a new and untried course by Dr. Stephen Peitzman became invaluable in my research. Or I could write a biography, maybe even about Anna Dabai, until I found that had already been done. And actually, she's almost like a folk hero in India because her story is so amazing. So I then thought, well, what about historical fiction, where I could apply my love of history and research the college and its students and graduates to educate readers, while also imagining the emotional response, because that's what the fictionalized element allows you to do, to think about what was the response, what were the emotions that these women were feeling as they're trying to go through medical school and graduate and their work afterwards. What would be some of the dialogue that they'd have? So that's what fiction, historical fiction, can do. And so I could be able to tell a story about a young woman who in 1897 enters women's medical, earns her degree, and goes on to unlock her path. And that's during a time when less than 5% of all of our doctors were women. Anyone want to guess what the percentages are now?
50.
Not quite.
39.
We're about 37, 38, 39. For practicing professionals, women make up that amount right now. Of course, in some of the OBGYNs and pediatrics, the numbers are much higher, but kind of across the board in other specialties. However, 51% of medical students today are women.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so they're coming. They're coming. They're going to even that out very soon. So I decided I would write, of course, historical fiction. And it comes in part from the adage of write what you know, because historical fiction is my favorite genre, and I do think it creates a platform to reach more readers, versus just a kind of a dry nonfiction book. So we can escape into those different eras and experience the sights and the sounds and the sensations of the past. And not only escape, but to learn. So I have been given this type of talk ever since the first book released 3 years, or I think I've spoken at over 70 libraries. And at one of them, a woman purchased my books, and she said, I don't really read a lot of historical fiction, but this sounded like an interesting talk, so I came tonight. And the next day, she sent me an email with a note. I am a new fan to historical fiction, with your book coming early in my fandom. If only my history teachers in school had assigned books like yours, instead of putting dry facts and dates on the blackboard for us to memorize, I would have loved history. So I really do think her note speaks volumes about using historical fiction as a form of storytelling, making those events relatable to foster empathy and deeper insights into the complexities of history as it captivates readers for a compelling blend of inspiration and education. I was also thinking about the popularity of the genre. So Miles has stepped out, but I'm being recorded, so I can still ask the question, because I usually like to put the librarians on the spot if they can name the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for the past 3 years. Does anyone want to toss out what you think is won? I'll give you a hint. They're all historical fiction, past 3 years. 3 years ago, we had Trust by Hernan Diaz, set in the 1920s. 2024 was Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips, Reconstruction period, post-Civil War. And this year, James by Percival L. Everett, which is the reimagined storytelling of a different perspective of Big Jim from Huckleberry Finn. So what about your everyday avid reader? I think I heard some of you are in book clubs. Book clubs love historical fiction. Every title up here is historical fiction, with the exception of Boys in the Boat, which is nonfiction, but about history. So, fan favorites. I might as well write in a genre where a lot of people are going to be looking for new titles. Bestsellers. Anyone want to guess what the #1 best-selling novel of 2024 was? Nope, that came out toward the end of this year, so.
Give us a hint.
Of course. Was also the #1 book checked out of libraries in 2024, The Women by Kristen Hanna.
I was going to bring that up because when you were saying how few women there were, but in that book, what really brings forth is how many people said, "Oh no, there were no women."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And still classified as historical fiction, which a lot of us find it hard to swallow, that 50 years ago is kind of the linchpin of what's considered historical fiction if it's set 50 years ago or more in the past. And then certainly, if you're not familiar with it, it is about the nurses in Vietnam. And finally, one other kind of phenomenon I think has come about from historical fiction is how many TV shows or movies and films are being adapted. Some of those book club bestsellers you saw, Where the Crawdads Sing, Boys in the Boat, a lot of those are being adapted. And even one of my personal favorites, anyone read The Personal Librarian?
Yes.
By Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray. Okay, the story of Belle DaCosta Green, the personal librarian for J.P. Morgan. Now, she was his personal librarian, and even after his death stayed on and worked for his son. And she worked at the library, I think, until the early 50s, right before her death. Of decades she worked there. The Morgan Museum and Library never did an exhibition about her until last year, after the book had been out. Do you think they ever would have done an exhibition if that book and the popularity of that book hadn't spurred them on? So here I am, actually in the gift shop with 2 book club besties that I met online. Shamila actually lives in Weymouth, and Deb lives in Maryland, and we met up in New York City for the first time in real life to go to the exhibit, which was fabulous. I think it's already closed now. Okay, I've been talking a lot. Let's take a quick break. You don't have to stand up if you want, but let's just do a quick little stretch. Just stretch, make sure you're all awake. I know, it's after dinner. And then bow down. Do a quick bow down to this woman. Because in my opinion, she has done more for historical fiction than any other recent author. This is Kristen Hanna. And in a November 2023 article in Esquire, The Mainstreaming of Historical Fiction, writer Sam Paul commented that Hanna's work features characters who are tested by great historical moments, like the Siege of Leningrad in Winter Garden, the Dust Bowl in The Four Winds, the French resistance during World War II in The Nightingale, and The Women. As readers, we become not only invested in their personal histories, but in their place in the history we all share. So I say, Thank you, Kristen Hanna. Keep going. I can't wait to see what she writes next for us readers and for us historical fiction authors. So finally, the third reason I chose historical fiction was the challenge. I mean, as if writing a book for someone with no experience in writing, creative writing, wasn't challenge enough, I really wanted to push myself in thinking about the ultimate success of being able to build character arcs and create characters and give them satisfying resolutions by the end of the book. Being able to balance all that research I had done in the archives and everywhere else and not let it turn into a nonfiction book. So balance the facts and the fiction. And go back to the drawing board when my editor would come back with red pens saying, this just is showing off your research. Does it move the story forward? If not, take it out. Put it in your author's notes. Authentic voices, very important. Just like I had no background in writing, I have no background in medicine. Okay, I have a psychology degree from Wheaton that I used in business. I never went the clinical route for psychology. I think I barely passed my Bio 101 class. I probably still have nightmares about that. So I had women who were medical students and women doctors give me input and read my manuscript as well. And then finally, writing historical fiction, we have to be conscious that it's being read through the lenses and perspectives of today's cultural climate. So I give you a quick example of what I mean by that. And I hope it's not a spoiler alert for anybody who's reading the book. I think you're already past it, Pam. So in The Unlocked Path, my main character, Eliza, is a maternity doctor. And in 1901, she delivers a baby with Down syndrome. But Down syndrome was not adopted as a term until the 1960s.
I never said exactly, but I knew what it was. Yeah.
So at the suggestion of a respected beta reader, I removed the word that was correct for the time that I had used, which was mongoloid. She had said she lives in the Pacific Northwest, and I have a tremendous community of friends of Asian descent. And they will take great offense to the use of the word mongoloid. And as a first-time writer, do you want to kick that hornet's nest? But she pointed out, you did such a great job in describing the child and his condition that people can infer what's wrong with him without your character announcing to the parents he's a mongoloid. I did use the word later on as a reference point, but it's not being spoken from the point of view of a character. So that's how I was trying to keep authentic to the times, but also being aware of today's cultural climate. So, a year and a half of research, a year and a half of writing and rewriting and crossing out and deleting whole paragraphs and pages and going back to the drawing board. I completed my manuscript. I queried, tried to find an agent. That took forever, didn't go anywhere. And finally found a small independent press that said when I submitted my proposal to them and they read the manuscript, it was one of the first 5-star reads they had had in a while. So Black Rose Writing published The Unlocked Path in August 2022, and it does follow a young woman. Here's my inspiration, my grandmother, the timeline of her life. Becoming a young woman, turning 18 in 1897, Philadelphia, because I never did learn my grandmother's story. So I created one for her. So I'd like to take just a moment and do a quick reading from The Unlocked Path, which is part of my inspiration for writing, as I said, was that woman, Daly Gopal Joshi. Now, why was her story so fascinating that it inspired me? Well, at Drexel, I found her application letter that she wrote to want to come to women's medical from India. And so I used part of that letter and part of her story and made her inspire my character to also want to go to medical school. So Eliza has met Daly at the school library where her aunt is a librarian. So she's just gone to work for the day with her aunt. No ideas of wanting to study medicine yet. And the aunt says, everyone loves Anna D. Her full name is Daly. Not only is she brilliant and dedicated to her studies, but what she's overcome inspires our students and staff. What do you mean, what she's overcome? Eliza asked. Quite a remarkable journey she's had. Among India's upper castes, it's customary for parents to arrange their children's marriages. Anna D. married a man 20 years older than her when she was 9 years old. Eliza's eyes widened. 9? She was a child. Shouldn't that be illegal or at least immoral? In this country, yes, but who are we to question another culture's customs? Fortunate for Anna D., her husband is well-educated and open-minded. He supported her decision to study medicine. That's progressive for a man who wed a 9-year-old, said Eliza. He's also a kind man who loves his wife. When Anna D. was 14, she bore their child. She barely recovered from the birth when the baby died from typhoid. With limited medical care available for her son and herself, grief and distress overwhelmed her. Those feelings turned to anger. It was then that she heeded a calling to care for others in her situation. With her husband, they researched how and where she could enroll to study medicine. Their search took 3 years until they discovered our women's medical and sent an application. At the time, I sat on the admissions committee. Her words moved me like none other I'd read before. I've kept a copy. And Josephine produced a folded sheet from her tote. I've got to get back to the library. I never know when a student might need my help. Read Anna D.'s letter, then come find me. Eliza unfolded the sheet and read the scripted words. The determination which has brought me to your country against the combined opposition of my friends and caste ought to go a long way towards helping me to carry out the purpose for which I came, which is to render to my poor suffering countrywomen the true medical aid they so sadly stand in need of, and which they would rather die than accept at the hands of a male physician. The voice of humanity is with me, and I must not fail. My soul is moved to help the many who cannot help themselves. This is an 18-year-old woman in India writing these words. And I still get chills when I read it. If I could write half as eloquently as she has here, talking about the plight of women and the lack of care and the fact, now remember, she's living in Victorian ruled India at the time, proprietary, no man should see another man's wife's body for medical purposes or anything. And women felt the same way. They didn't want a male doctor. So even though, women have been healers and midwives forever, the difference was modern medicine and the right to practice modern medicine with a degree in their hands was going to make a difference for so many, like Anna Daly. So I just applaud her, I'm in awe of her, and that's when I said, yes, let's write her story. So just like I never set out to write a book, I never set out to write a sequel. However, I took my manuscript, it was all done, and 2019, I wrote The End in December. February 2020, outrunning a certain episode of history, I went to a writers' conference and I met with some agents and editors and I talked to them about what my book was about. And it spanned a 50-year period, 1897 to 1947. And the agent editor, Paula Mounier, she actually writes great kind of cozy mysteries, said to me, "Are you crazy? How long is your manuscript?" I said, "Oh, I did my research, historical fiction, 350 pages, 92,000 words." She goes, "And you're covering 50 years of history. 50 years of the first half of the 20th century history. You can't do justice to that amount of history in 350 pages. So I suggest you take your manuscript and you go on home." She didn't know, but none of us knew we would have a lockdown coming. And write yourself about a 900-page book. But just keep in mind, is your name Ken Follett or Diana Gabaldon? No one is going to buy and invest their time in a 900-page book from an unknown author. You'll be better off finding a logical stopping point in your manuscript and setting your readers up for a sequel. So that's what I did. And I went home, and now I had a pandemic lockdown to go back into that manuscript and search and see what is the logical stopping point. And so I had some material for a sequel, but I also knew that I needed more to flesh it out. And I even took chapters from the original manuscript that came much, much later, and I dropped them into the first, that scene that you just read, Pam. That was then later on. Because I thought, what if there never is a sequel? I still want to address this issue and cover it. So I went back to work, I went back to Drexel, I did more research, and looked for some more inspiration. A couple of other women doctors that I just want to mention really quickly now. Dr. Esther Pohl Lovejoy. She was one of the doctors that went to France in World War I, forming the American Women's Hospital Unit. She came back and led that organization, which became the American Medical Women's Association for the next 47 years until her death in 1965 at the age of 94. An amazing, amazing woman. And the AMWA still exists, and I was fortunate enough to speak at their annual conference this past March that was held in Waltham. Another woman that I discovered in Drexel archives was Dr. Margaret Craighill, in uniform. So one of the pamphlets that I pulled out of a file folder, I asked Drexel to just pull anything that you have from the 30s and 40s. That was going to be the time period for the sequel, the 30s and 40s. And I'm just paging through everything, and I find a pamphlet. I'm like, what is this kind of odd-looking item? It was the hearings, congressional hearings, from 1943, 42, 43. So World War II breaks out, Pearl Harbor, US gets involved in the World War again. And again, women doctors are saying, we're ready to serve. US Army still is saying no. The women are pointing to a law that the War Department had just enacted, saying that medical people or medical persons can be called up for our draft. And they said, well, it's right here. Medical people. We're medical people. And they're like, well, we didn't mean women. So our fine Congress, not unlike today, spent 3 days debating whether women, doctors, surgeons, highly skilled, trained professionals could serve in the U.S. Army. And the difference here was going to be that they would receive military pay, ranks, and veteran benefits. Because they said, we're not doing this again without that recognition. So, yes, they finally debated for 3 days. Testimonies came in from all over the country, from other male doctors and women doctors saying, these women can do it, I know such and such, she wants to go, take her on. So Dr. Margaret Craighill became the first woman to receive ranking and went in as a major. So that was pretty amazing. And then finally, educating a little bit more of some of the information I found. Not just the World War II piece, but that American Women's Hospital unit, when they came back from France after World War I, many of them actually stayed in Europe for the rebuilding. And then they actually went to other war-torn areas of the time, Turkey and Syria, the Ottoman Empire areas. And then the 1930s and the Depression hit. And they turned their attention to the dire, dire situations here in the Americas, particularly the rural South, where health care in the Appalachian areas was non-existent, and where people were just living in squalor, and maternal and infant mortality rates were through the roof, and were an embarrassment how high those rates were in America, and the lack of access to vaccines and other health care. And so the American Women's Hospital units formed their own programs teaching nutrition, pellagra. Malnutrition was a huge disease situation. They were getting cows and bringing those to families. They had a mobile unit that they drove through the mountains and mud-filled roads of Appalachia. They opened maternity shelters. They had well baby care classes, teaching parents and older siblings, and just an incredible amount of work throughout the rural South. So my second book highlights and honors the work of these women. Not unlike in some respects, you know, the work that packhorse librarians brought literacy to those areas, that we learned about them through the book Women of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson and The Giver of Stars from Jojo Moyes. These women were bringing health care to the country. And so again, I thought that they needed to be celebrated and the stories told. And maybe, with all of your help here today, maybe my book will have 1 million copies sold, or have Reese's little badge of honor for book club choice on the front cover. So, you know, I really, was amazed at the information I was receiving. And then I also wanted to turn to the 40s and World War II, which was my parents' generation. And so I looked for a little bit more inspiration right from the source, my parents. Now, they've both been gone for 34 and almost 20 years now. But they were that greatest generation. My dad was in the Navy during World War II, served in the South Pacific for 22 months. My mom was home living with her parents in Dedham. They met at a USO dance in Boston, got engaged. I don't even know how many dates they had, honestly. Got engaged, and my dad shipped off but said, I'm not getting married until I make sure I come home. And so they got married October 22nd, 1945. And anybody knows their history, that was less than 2 months after VJ Day, 10 days after my dad's ship pulled into Oakland, California. And my mom took the train by herself, went out there, and they got married at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco.
They look like movie stars.
Don't they? Don't they? So in terms of, I knew a few stories, that my mom had talked about, walking home from the train in blackout conditions and, using pancake makeup on her legs because you didn't have nylons during the war and all. But my dad never talked about his service. And he stayed in the Navy. He stayed in the Reserve for another 25 years. But he would never talk about being on a landing craft infantry ship in the South Pacific for 22 months. So I do a lot of talks with genealogy societies as well, and one hint I give folks is if you are tasked with cleaning out the family home, raise your hand, and raise your hand over your brothers, because I knew my brothers would go into that house that my parents had lived in for 54 years, and they would have just tossed everything in the dumpster. Everything. And I said, nope, I don't care. I'll do it after work, weekends, as long as it takes. And I'm going through every cabinet, every drawer, every closet, everything. Because who knows what my mother with dementia, particularly, at the end, had hidden in the house. So I did find her sterling silver buried in the box in the attic with the Halloween costumes from the 1960s. So yeah, my brother would have opened that, seen the clown costume from 1968 and just heaved the whole thing, I'm sure. But what about that box in the back corner of the attic? The flat box that my dad's shirts used to come back from the dry cleaners in, that were kind of mouse chewed in the corners and silverfish running through the inside. Do you think my brothers would have sat down with the one light bulb hanging and opened that box and looked inside and found years of letters from my dad written from his ship in the South Pacific? So I had to use those as inspiration in my second book, where Eliza is now a much more mature character. She is the mother. Her sons are serving in the war, and one is in the Navy in the South Pacific. So, last one I have to mention, of course, last woman from the 30s and 40s. You can't write a book set in that time period without mentioning. Thank you. Absolutely, Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most influential women of history. And in 1933, just as FDR was taking his first term in office, she wrote a book. And this is the height of the Depression, and it's called It's Up to the Women. And she says and advises women, whether subtly or voraciously, have always been a tremendous power in the destiny of the world. Yes, they have. So I found this book in the gift shop during another research trip when I visited for my second book, research, and I traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, FDR's rehabilitation center for polio patients. So I'm not going to give any spoiler alerts there, except that in this book, Eliza travels a few different paths throughout the story. So I now have caught the writing bug. I have published 2 books I'm very proud of, to the dismay of many of the book clubs that I meet with. They're like, well, what's next? I'm like, no. We've left Eliza in a good place, good character arc between the 2 books. Time to move on to some other characters. What am I going to write next? Because now I have to. I have to find another woman's story from history that I can write about and to share with others. And so I actually found the inspiration on a bookshelf at home after cleaning out my parents' attic. And the book is called With Old Glory in Berlin. And it's a memoir that was published in 1918, and it was edited by my grandfather, Elliot Robinson, who was a novelist, a lawyer, a composer, an artist, and I don't know what this crazy article was. Apparently he ran into a burning house or something. That's why he says, and other things, becomes a fireman. So in 1918, he edited this woman's memoir. Now, having read several of his other books, his novels, and knowing that he had ghost written another memoir, I am 100% certain he ghost wrote this book. So he heard Josephine Therese's story, and he wrote the memoir with and for her. So I picked up the book and I read it, and I was like, wow, it's another woman from history we've never heard about. A 1916, she's 17 years old, a Jewish woman living in Boston, who decides she's going to go to Berlin to study opera.
Opera?
Opera. Now, history buffs again, test your knowledge. 1916, yes, World War I is under full-blown across France, horrible battles across France and Belgium. America doesn't enter the war until April 1917. So she goes over in October 1916, but then is living and studying there when war breaks out, and now she's enemy of the state. And it takes her 8 months to get home to America. So all of what she has to go through to get out of that country when she's now under suspicion of being an enemy of the state. Even written that they believe she was one of the last Americans that got out, civilians. So I wanted to write this story, but I wanted to fictionalize it a little bit and make the story more interesting, because this, oh my God, if it wasn't my grandfather, I never would have picked this up. It's so dry and boring, and the prose is from that time period, and it's just awful. But the story is fabulous. So I wanted to write Josephine's stories, so I did more research, and I found things like her emergency passport application when she was in Germany to get home, actually issued by the Spanish embassy, because the American embassy had already closed by the time she was trying to get out. The articles about her in the Boston papers when she gets home, and that she's telling her story. And the point of her telling her story at that time was to make sure Americans knew what was going on in Germany, that we can defeat them. You don't understand how awful life is over there for the Germans, between the rations and the sacrifices and the deaths. And the German populace wants the war to end, but it's the propaganda machine that's not letting anyone know that. So she comes back to tell her story through a couple of articles and then through the book. So, historical fiction, Under Two Flags, is coming March 26, 2026. This is just about the final cover that I've just seen from my designer. I was just waiting to add another fellow author blurb, which just came in yesterday, and I'm thrilled with early readers that have read my manuscript: Kate Quinn, Martha Hall Kelly, and Eliza Knight. And they all have put their mark of approval on it. So I'm very excited for Josephine's story to come out. And I thank these other historical fiction authors for the books that they've written, and so many of them have also written about women in histories telling their stories. So I'm happy to take any questions. I am online, my website, email, Facebook, which is where Ginny found me, Instagram. That's all I can handle. Don't be looking for me on TikTok or Snapchat or X or any of those other things. And I do have a newsletter that if you'd like to sign up, I put out about once a month, which has book reviews, giveaways, information about my books, my writing, my events. And in March, I celebrate Women's History Month by putting together a list of 31 titles. Where did I put it? Where did it go? 31 titles to read for Women's History Month. So my newsletter will announce next year's list, and they're all historical fiction, but they're all women's stories that, thankfully, to those authors writing those stories, that we're being inspired and educated so much more about that history deficient disorder. We're trying to remedy that just by reading. So happy to take any questions.
I have two quick ones.
Sure.
Do you get to pick your own titles?
I do, and that is primarily because I am working with a smaller press. Now, these authors all work with what's called traditional, the Big Five. Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, William Morrow, and all. And they often don't have final say over the title or their cover, and often are told to make some pretty dramatic edits to their story. My publisher gives me a lot of creative license. He trusts me.
And thank you. And the other question is, I would think it's really hard to make up believable dialogue.
Yeah.
Like that would be like.
Actually, that's my favorite part. I just talk it. I just talk it out loud. Yeah.
Like, okay, so like real people would speak.
Yeah, I just try to be very natural, but then I have to be cognizant of the time period. You know, particularly the time periods I'm writing is a much more formal way of talking. And interactions and introductions, you know, the formal introductions, may I present, so not like, hey, here's Joe. So yeah, I love writing the dialogue because it allows you to show so much about the characters too. Sure.
I have a question about research, like
Yeah.
especially since like everything's so different. So when you're finding like, of the example you just gave, the book that's coming out, like
Yeah.
the passport and the other piece of information,
Yeah.
like how are you find? And you might have just said this because I wasn't here at the beginning, but where do you find? Like where are you going? Like are you online? Is there? So like we used to have microfeed.
Yeah, so I started online. Now, what was difficult, because I wanted to learn more about Josephine. Now, what was interesting, but all I had was this book. And her byline is Josephine Therese. She didn't use her last name. She was fearful. Well, but she was fearful because she was telling what's going on in Germany. How could maybe Germans living in America, and a lot of them were, you know, suspected of being spies during World War I. World War II, we rounded them up and put them in internment camps like we did the Japanese. But World War I, so she was fearful and did not let her name go on the book. So I didn't even know her last name. So to your point about research, I mean, I was doing everything. I was going into my newspapers.com, which is a tremendous resource, and I was trying to search, you know, Boston newspapers and just put in Josephine Therese, couldn't find anything. I went to the New England Conservatory and I asked, do you know of any opera students? You know, do you have any archives? They came back with nothing. I went to the Boston Public Library and they came back. And they're the ones that found for me the article that had her last name because for whatever reason, it wasn't posted in my newspapers.com. It needed a much broader search that I didn't have access to. So the research librarian at the BPL found that article that has her last name in it. And then I was able to find online her passport. And then once I had her name, I was able to, you know, then search, and I found a couple of other things. Interestingly enough, in the book, she never once mentions that she was Jewish. Now this is World War I, so a little bit different, but anti-Semitism still very strong then too. But I find her wedding announcement in 1919. And the wedding held at Temple, I can't remember what it was. I find her addresses from the city census reports, another great place for researching. So just by knowing where she lived, I could discern a lot, and learned she lived in a couple of different places before and after her father died. So after her father, when her father was alive and owned a couple of stores, they lived in the heart of the Jewish community at the time in Dorchester and Roxbury. Actually, Roxbury had a very strong Jewish community. And then after her father died, it looked like the mother and the 4 children moved to more of a boarding house type place, which was directly across the street from one of the biggest temples. And then she was, I found the grandparents' gravestone through Find a Grave at the big Jewish cemetery. It's like in Brookline area maybe. But so then all of a sudden I realized she's Jewish. So I brought that into the retelling and reimagined story as well. So there are so many resources, but the libraries, archives, at colleges, at historical societies, they have so much information, and we're so lucky that they're preserving it and digitizing a lot of it. Yeah.
I have a question about the women at the medical college when it first would have started.
Yeah.
Where would they have done residency internships? Who would have let them in?
Not many. So many did not take them at all. Some would say, okay, well, 2 positions. You know, say they had 30 positions. We'll slot 2 for the women. Women's Medical College in Philadelphia actually was the first college to open an associated hospital.
Which one?
Women and children.
Oh, wow.
And that primarily was to give their graduates jobs. Yeah.
And a comment on the unlocked path.
Yeah.
Twice so far, I heard this quote, and I'm only halfway through, but I think it's great, is, you know, women are born doctors, men are taught to be doctors.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was such a...
I've got a good friend in my book club. When I was trying to find my title, she suggested that. She goes, I love that line. Women were born doctors.
I think, like I said, at least twice, I think now I've seen it.
Yeah.
In there. There might be
Yeah.
more.
So it was a theme. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Yeah.
And just when you were asking about places to find things and all the letters, I volunteer at the Canton Historical Society, and I can't tell you how many stacks of letters,
Yeah.
you know, and they were in that beautiful hand script that you can't even read.
I know you can't
They
read.
are digitizing a lot
Yeah.
of that. There's been a lot of grants
Yeah.
recently. So
The Library of Congress has a huge project. If anyone's interested, they're just looking for people to transcribe. Yeah, they have a lot of material that needs to be transcribed and digitized, and it's because it is so hard to read.
No, not only that, some of it's like on rice paper.
Yeah.
You know, with time, it's
Yeah.
gonna be there.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep. Great. Yeah.
How did they pick a particular date for your book to come out?
Oh, absolutely 100% based on my publisher's schedule. They're a small press, so they only publish 100 titles a year. So when I contracted with them in October of 21, they said they didn't have an opening until August of 2022, which was okay. I was fine with that because another publisher that I almost went with had told me they couldn't get me out until spring of 23, and I didn't want to wait any longer. Yeah. Great. Anything else? Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for coming out and sharing a love of history.